everyone. I'm Linda Nickell, and welcome to the Happiness Hour. My goal here is to help us all connect, inspire, and create. Every week, a new speaker joins us to share a bit of inspiration, creativity, and their photography expertise. Upcoming presentations can be found on my website at lindanickell.com. Under Happiness Hour, you'll find the links to my YouTube channel and our community blog. Erin Randall is here to help me keep on track, and you can find her at admilyoracoaching.com. Say hello, Erin.
Hello, Erin.
My guest tonight is Brenda Petrella. Brenda is a nature and landscape photographer based in Vermont. She is the creator of the Outdoor Photography School, where she teaches online photography workshops and offers portfolio reviews. On her website, outdoorphotographyschool.com, you're going to find a lot of resources that include articles, how-to videos, and in April, Brenda will launch the Outdoor Photography School podcast. In tonight's presentation, Nature Photography in Non-Iconic Locations, Brenda's going to discuss how to create compelling nature compositions without traveling to iconic locations, how to find subjects and convey your message. And she'll suggest some exercises to do locally to boost your creativity. So welcome to the Happiness Hour, Brenda.
Thank you so much, Linda. I'm really excited to be here.
I'm thrilled to have you. And before you get started, I mentioned that you're in Vermont, so maybe tell us a little bit about, kind of that area and how you got started in nature and landscape photography, and just kind of give us a little bit of background, and feel free to fill in anything that I skimmed over and you'd like to share with us.
Sure. I actually had one of my first slides on that, but we can skip that once I get to the presentation.
Okay.
But that's okay. So my background is actually in molecular biology. So I have sort of a different path to photography. I'm a trained cancer researcher, and I had a research lab for a number of years. And it got to the point where I just really missed spending time in the outdoors, which is really where my heart is. And so back in 2016, I made the big, difficult decision to close the doors on my science career and figure out what I could do to change my lifestyle so that I could spend more time outside. And I had always had this passion and interest in photography, and it seemed like a good opportunity to pursue that more fully. And so that's really when I started to put more time and effort into my photography. And one of my first trips that I went on was to the Yukon Territory up in Canada to shoot the Northern Lights in the middle of winter. And it was an absolutely incredible experience. It was, minus 30 degrees and absolutely freezing, but it was so incredibly beautiful. And that sort of cinched it for me. I could not look back after that. And so yeah, then I started a YouTube channel just to sort of test the waters to see how much I enjoyed teaching and doing video. And that started to take off, and that sort of morphed into Outdoor Photography School. And as you said, I'm going to be starting this podcast in April called the Outdoor Photography Podcast. So I've been already starting to interview people for that, which has been really fun. So yeah, that's where we are today. So I'm in Vermont, as you said. I actually grew up in New Jersey, but I came up here to go to graduate school in New Hampshire and fell in love with the rural communities up here and never left. So I've been up here now for about 20 years.
Well, and I told you this when you and I were chatting. I was preparing for a trip to Switzerland, and I'm not a hiker, and I'd never really been in snow, and I kind of felt like I would have that opportunity there. And so I got on YouTube and I Googled or searched snow photography, and some of the search, my searches showed up, your video was in there, and you were like the only female in that bunch that kind of came up as this might be what you're looking for. So I watched it, and I was kind of watching you tromp through the snow, and I thought, okay, she's kind of, she's easy to follow, and you explain things so concisely, and I could get it. And then you basically fell in the river, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, this is not what I signed up for. And but I kind of binge watched a little bit of your channel, and then I watched the next one, and I was like, okay, this, you just kind of made it easy, and I felt really comfortable watching you. And then you started this, and I have to admit, I started it, and I have not had time to go back. But photopills comes up a lot of times in topics that people want. Guys, she has a whole series of how to use photopills. So I think that's on your YouTube channel. Is
Yep.
that there, or is
Yep.
it on your website? Probably both.
It's
So
on both. Yeah. If you go to Outdoor Photography School and go to the videos tab, there'll be a special button that will bring you to all of the Photopills videos, but you can also find them on YouTube. So the YouTube channel is called Outdoor Photography School, and the Photopills episodes are called Photopills Fridays,
yeah,
because I did them for every Friday for like 6 months. Was a how-to video on photopills.
I made it through like 4 of them, maybe 5, and then I kind of got busy at work and haven't gone back, but I will, I promise, because I need to learn how to use photopills. Okay, with that, I'm going to let you start your presentation if you're
Okie
ready.
doke.
And
Sure. How's that look?
it looks great. You're good.
All right. Well, thank you for that introduction, Linda. That was really nice, and it was fun to chat for a little bit too. And I also I wanted to say that I think what you're doing with the Happiness Hour is just brilliant. I love that you're bringing together this wonderful community of photographers from all over the place. Normally people would be meeting in camera clubs maybe, and we really can't do that right now. And I just think it's so great that you're connecting people in these ways around this passion that we all share. So kudos to you for keeping it going. And I think it's a good example of a good thing that can come out of this crazy pandemic.
I think so too. I've made a lot of friends here in the room. I give a lot of them a hard time, but I it's been fun to see them, every week show up and see what's next. So
Yeah, it's exciting. So I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to just skip over this because we already talked
okay.
about it. So we'll just jump right into the outline for today. So being in Vermont, Vermont is a beautiful state, but it's not a very iconic location. One reason is because we have no national parks here. So we have a lot of, we have a national forest, and we have a bunch of state forests and state parks, but no national parks that draw huge crowds. And one of the reasons for that is because, we don't really have that big grand landscape. So Vermont's sort of known for its fall colors, and not really a whole lot out of that to sort of the world outside of Vermont. So it's a great place to practice shooting non-iconic images. So I'm going to go over some of the 5 benefits of photographing in a non-iconic location. I'm then going to talk about the ways that I approach trying to find subjects to photograph in locations like Vermont. I'm going to discuss 4 elements that I think every composition should have. Then we're going to just talk briefly about a composition case study of an image that, I tried different compositions and sort of my thought process behind how I got to the final one, and see if you can see sort of that progression. I'm going to share with you some examples from my backyard to hopefully illustrate that you don't really have to go very far at all to start to tune into some of these more intimate and small scene compositions that you can find just in your own backyard. And that just because there are people who love to talk about gear, and I don't know if there's going to be any gear people in the conversation today, I'm going to do briefly over gear, both photography gear and outdoor gear, and some tips on safety and preparation for doing nature photography, which will be mostly geared towards the Northeast, but hopefully, it'll be applicable to other locations as well. And lastly, I'll go over some of these exercises that I've done that I find to be helpful when I'm trying to push my skills a little bit. So all my images today are going to be from Vermont, with the exception of one, which is from New Hampshire. So let's start with the benefits of photographing in non-iconic locations. So in some ways it's really easy to photograph the icons because we've seen them so many times on social media and in print media. And so we kind of already intuitively know what compositions are going to work and what is going to look good. I think it's much more challenging to find compelling compositions in non-iconic locations, such as your backyard. And I think this year with the pandemic, this has been a great opportunity to practice improving these types of skills in your photography and getting more comfortable with your camera and lenses and learning to see compositions. So I think that non-iconic locations are a great way to start to train your eye to recognize different elements that can be used in composition. Another benefit is that if it's in a local location to you, you can revisit it many, many times in order to get the best shot. So this is an example of a tree that I've always been, it's always piqued my interest every time I've driven past it. It always catches my eye. And so this year I thought, maybe I should do a little tree project on this tree and just start photographing it. And so it's only, 2 miles from my house, and I was able to get there in all different weather, different seasons. And I don't feel like I've gotten the shot that I really want yet, but it's a good way to start practicing and comparing how one scene can change in multiple different ways at different times of year and different times of day. One other benefit is that it can help you hone in on your own artistic vision. I think when we're shooting iconic locations, our own expression in those images can kind of get lost in a way. And so it's harder to really try to dig deep and express what it is you want to express in an image that's been, photographed so many times. And I also think that doing this will help you with those shooting those iconic locations when you are there. So you might take the shot that everyone's used to seeing, but you now have trained your eye to see other types of compositions. And so you'll get to get more out of that experience ultimately. And lastly, you'll get to spend more time in nature, which I think is the best benefit of it all, is that it is a way of practicing your photography and perfecting your craft. And I think there's nothing better than spending more time outdoors. So one thing that I like to think about when I'm out is not, going out to take an image, but rather switching the mindset a little bit and thinking about finding an image. So it's sort of a way of bringing a little bit of curiosity to the process and more inquisitive process rather than I'm going to go take this image of this waterfall. It's more about where is the image in this waterfall, and you start to ask that question more. So that leads me into finding different subjects. So I want to start off by talking about 4 elements of what I think a great image would consist of. So one is having a clear subject. 2 is having compositional elements in the scene, which we'll talk a little bit more about, that contribute to leading the viewer to that subject. It's sort of they are like supporting characters for the main subject of the photograph. Compositional arrangements. So this could be things like the rule of thirds or any other different types of arrangements that are basically how do you coordinate the relationship between these various compositional elements in the scene and the subject to create a whole composition that has a specific effect. And then lastly is the technique. So this is exposure technique, the field of view, the point of view, depth of field, that sort of thing. And often we focus so much on technique that we forget about some of these other elements. And I think it really starts with that finding that clear subject. So in today's talk, I'm going to be focusing just on the first 2 puzzle pieces, and we'll touch upon some of the others. But I have a workshop that I'm giving this month. The next one is tomorrow and the following Thursday, called Compose with Clarity. And I go into much more detail on those other elements if you're interested in learning more about that. So Ansel Adams said that there's nothing worse than a sharp image of a fuzzy concept. And I think what he meant by that is that you can have the best gear in the world and the best technique, but if you don't really know what your image is about or what you're trying to convey, or what your intent is for that image, then it might as well be out of focus, because that purpose will be sort of lost on the viewer. So I think the question then becomes, how do we identify our intent and then apply the right compositional methods in order to communicate our message to the viewer? And I think it starts with having a clear subject. So how do we find the subject? Well, in my opinion, the first step is to really slow down and connect with the scene. I think often we're moving too fast, and it's really easy to just kind of skip over everything. Say one of my favorite things to photograph are waterfalls and streams. And so, that's where my mind goes when I try to think of examples is, hiking along and just getting to the waterfall and forgetting about all of the things on the way that I could be photographing before I get to that waterfall. We tend to focus on the main event rather than all of these other little things. So slowing down and connecting with the scene. And there are various ways to do that. And sometimes if I find myself in a location and I'm just not feeling it, I'm like, ugh, I feel like there's got to be something here and I'm just not seeing it. One trick that I'll do sometimes is to activate my senses. And this may sound a little woo woo or whatever, but to just try to be like, okay, what are 5 things that I can see? What are 4 things that I can hear? What are 3 things that I can smell? And what are 2 things that I can touch? And sort of going through that little step-by-step checklist, you start to now tune into your surroundings in a much more intimate way. And this has helped me to, say, identify birds in the area, or realize that I was hiking in a hardwood forest, and now I'm in a boreal forest, and I can smell the evergreens and the pine and the mossy ground. And I wasn't really tuned into that change before I sort of went through this exercise. So it's just bringing awareness to your surroundings. And then I think the next big step is to just be curious. So, think like a little kid, or like a detective. Put your detective hat on and start to ask questions. So I'm going to share with you some of the questions that I ask myself when I'm going through looking for compositions. So one, what is my eye going to? What was the first thing that caught my eye? And then, well, what does my eye keep going back to? It might not be the first thing that I was drawn to, but I might keep glancing back and, feeling myself being pulled in this one direction. So what is it? And what is it about that caught my eye? So is it light? Is it texture? Is it a relationship between different objects? Trying to figure out why is that compelling? And then I'll think about, well, how did it make me feel? Do I feel like so excited and energetic, or is it making me feel calm and peaceful? Is it an image or a scene that feels like a transition? There's a lot of motion going on. And that can help me figure out what is it that I'm trying to express in the image, in terms of how I was feeling when I was there. And then it can also inform the different techniques that I might use. So, for instance, if motion is a big part of the image, then I'm going to be thinking about shutter speeds, and how to capture that motion or freeze that motion. And then sometimes it's helpful to ask, well, why do I even want to make a picture of this? Like, is it just to a memory, or is it something more than that? And I'm not saying that taking beautiful pictures for the sake of taking beautiful pictures isn't good enough. Like, I think that's also a great thing to do. But sometimes when we need to, dive a little deeper, it's good to ask, well, why am I taking this image? Then I also like to think about, okay, so I took that. What else is obvious? Like, what else do I see? And would these make better subjects? And sometimes what I'll do, and I think this relates to one of the exercises I suggest at the end, but and that is to say I've spent some time in a scene photographing different compositions, and then I think I'm done. Time to move on. Sometimes I'll be like, okay, 5 minutes. I'm just going to give myself 5 minutes, and I'm not going to move, and I'm just going to sit here and observe. And often all these other compositions pop out of nowhere, So sometimes just giving yourself that time to do that will help you see and recognize these new things. And then another thing that can help is to consider, okay, well, if I was to say, write a postcard to my best friend and tell them about this scene, how would I describe it? What words would I use? And that gets you to start thinking about what the scene is about rather than what the scene is of. So it's sort of making that shift between, well, I'm taking a picture of a waterfall. That's a noun, but what is it about? What is it about that waterfall? What are some adjectives that I can throw in there that describe the waterfall or the scene in general? So those are ways that help me tune into what the subject might be and what the image is about. And another Ansel Adams quote, he said that a great photograph is one that fully expresses what one feels in the deepest sense about what is being photographed. So I think he's trying to hone in on that concept of, it's not just what the image is of, it's what it's about. So I'm going to give you some examples here. This is my New Hampshire waterfall. um, so, it's a beautiful waterfall. It's an impressive waterfall, but there was something about it, something else about it that kept drawing my attention. And so I spent some time trying to figure that out. And I realized that it wasn't the overall shape of the waterfall or the power or the sound or any of that, or even that large boulder at the top that looked like it was ready to fall over. Instead, it was just this tiny little section here where my eye kept going. And so I zoomed in on that and got a completely different, composition. It has a different feel. Instead of feeling, big and powerful, it instead conveys a more subtle concept of the flowing water. And it's a little bit more ethereal feeling. This is another example of, we could say, well, it's an image of a tree and a rock. But to me, what drew my eye was the relationship between the tree and the rock. So to me, this symbolized the resilience of nature finding a way to survive against all odds. And so, in a way, I then intentionally cut off the rock a little bit, and I intentionally cut off the trees just to focus in on that one aspect of this relationship between the two, and how the tree and the rock have sort of become one. In this example, the image is of a small farmhouse, but what it's about is this idea of living a simplified but fulfilling lifestyle, perhaps, or maybe it's removed from modern conveniences, and so you can start to pretend and think about, like, well, what is it like to live in this farmhouse off in the woods? Um, that's how it feels to me. To somebody else, this might look like hell. It might be like, oh, this looks like isolation and loneliness. you know um and so that's another example of just to remember that different people bring their own stories to images, and you have your interpretation of what you're trying to convey. People will still have their own as well, so it's not like you're going to get everyone to see exactly what you're seeing every single time. This is an image of a waterfall, but it's about, in my mind, it's about the juxtaposition of the flowing water and the accumulation of snow. And it's indicating the onset of winter and this, feeling of the transition of elements and time to sort of hunker down and get cozy. So some other considerations around when you're honing in on your subject is to ask, well, how much of the frame should the subject fill? And, there's no right answer to that. It's really about what you want to draw the viewer's attention to. But this will help you understand, well, which focal length should you pick? So what lenses should you use? Would using negative space around the subject further accentuate the subject in some way, or using a wider angle lens so that you're incorporating more of the environment around the subject, would that be more informative, or really just isolating it with a telephoto lens might be the better story? Also consider what's in the foreground and in the background, and does that support the subject in any way? So if you do have a really interesting foreground element that will lead the viewer into the image somehow, then a wide angle lens is probably what you want to go with. Um, Conversely, if you have a really busy background, you might want to shift where you are and use a shallow depth of field so that you're blurring out that background and drawing more attention to the subject in that way. The other thing to keep in mind is to look for any mergers between your subject and the background, because that can happen a lot of times. And Like an example of this would be, I have this image of a moose in a lake, and there was a dead tree root system behind it. And, I got a picture of the moose with the root system behind it. And I didn't see it in the field when I was there. When I got home, it was like, oh, it looks like these roots are coming out of the moose's head, and it was a big distraction. So, try to look for those things when you're out in the field, because sometimes just shifting your positioning a little bit can resolve that. Other distractions can happen, around the edges of the frame. In nature photography, it's often to get, twigs and, branches and things sort of coming into your scene that might not be that noticeable when you're taking the photograph. And then consider whether other points of view, high, low, different perspectives, would that help draw the attention to the subject any better than how you were originally planning? And we already kind of talked about this, but what depth of field would best tell the story about the subject? Now, well, one thing that I've started using lately, and I don't know if anyone here has done this, but using a composition card. I don't know if you can see, I have one here too. It's hard to see with the Zoom thing, but all it is a piece of cardboard with a hole cut out in the middle. That's the aspect ratio of my camera sensor. So, 3x2 or 4x3, whatever kind of camera you have. If you hold it at arm's length, like in this example, that's basically mimicking what a telephoto lens would look like. And if you hold it closer to your eyes, then that's more of a wide angle view. And the purpose of this is to, when you're out hiking and you're spending all day out in the field, it's a convenient way to not have to unpack all of your gear and scope out a location, only to find out that there's not really a whole lot going on there and you want to move on to the next one. So I use this to sort of gauge, is it worth setting up everything? Or also to kind of, that little frame is enough to kind of block out any sort of distractions and helps your eye be like, oh, this is the interesting thing. So when you're asking that question of what is my eye being drawn to, or where is my eye going back to a lot, this can help with that question. And they're easy to make. So now we'll move on to the 4 elements of composition. There are many elements, but we're going to focus on 4 today. So finding different compositional elements. As I mentioned earlier, I like to think of these things as sort of supporting characters for the subject and how they help tell the story. Can you use them to guide the viewer back to the main subject, or to somehow accentuate the subject in some way? So it's helpful to keep in mind that our eyes are naturally drawn to different things. And so 4 main things are lighter areas over darker areas, areas of contrast, and this can be tonal contrast or color contrast, or even textural contrast, things like that. Lines, curves, and shapes, whether they're real or implied. Our eyes like to follow lines. We find that to be very soothing. And warmer colors tend to attract more than cooler colors, which you can even see in my background. Like the warmer colors are popping out and the cooler colors are receding. And even in if you have a scene that has warm colors and cool colors, in post-processing, you can further create a little bit of depth in your image by warming up your highlights and cooling down your shadows a little bit. That's one way to sort of take advantage of this thing that our brain does, which is our eyes get drawn to the warmer colors first. And we kind of already talked about distractions and how to change if you have a distraction in your scene, what to do to change that. So let's go over these 4 areas. So we'll consider these sort of the 4 buckets of compositional elements that we're going to focus on. As I said, there are a couple of others, but these I think are some of the most useful to pay attention to. First, a couple of considerations around light. So I am of the opinion that there's no such thing as bad light. There are a lot of photographers who say, oh, you should only be shooting in golden hour, or all around the low light of the morning or evening. And that is beautiful light, no doubt. But to say that there's bad light or no opportunities for photographing during quote unquote bad light, I think is limiting you. And I like to compare this idea to a Scandinavian saying that says that there's no such thing as bad weather, just bad clothing. So, if you dress right for the weather, you're going to have a great time. So I think the same can be said for light. If you assess the light appropriately first, then you can start to seek out compositions that's going to work best for the light you have. Um, I have a 2-year-old daughter, and I don't get to go out and photograph as much as I'd like to anymore. And, so whatever light I can get, I'm going to be grateful for the opportunity. And it does help to sort of keep that in mind and not get discouraged. So how do we start to assess light? So you want to think about, well, what is the nature of light on the subject? So think about the direction of the light. Is it coming from the front, the back, the side? Is direct or into the light going to make an interesting composition? And, we can manipulate this a little bit by changing our position. So say you're photographing a flower and it's front lit, meaning the light is coming from behind you and lighting up the flower. That's going to have a very different feel to that image than if it was side lit or even backlit, where it might be lighting up the edges of the flower. So you can change your position often to get those, change your position relative to the direction of the light to get different types of feelings and compositions. And then the other thing to consider is the quality of the light. So light can be soft, harsh, which would be like your midday light. Even flat would be the light that you would get on a cloudy, overcast day. So basically, the clouds are acting like a giant softbox in the sky, and it's eliminating all shadow details that could be there. There's dappled light, which can also be like spotlight, low angle light, which is that golden hour light and a little bit after golden hour. And then there's also reflected light. So sand and snow and canyon walls are great ways to use reflected light. And when you're assessing light, it's always good to keep in mind the shadows, because we don't necessarily see shadows as easily as we see light. But our cameras do. And part of the reason for that also, it has to do with how our eyes are, how our eyes work. So we have a much bigger dynamic range that we can see visually than our cameras can see. So we basically fill in all those little gray details and don't notice them quite as much, but the camera will make it more distinct once we take the picture. So it's good to just be mindful of those things when you're out. Also consider, is the light the subject? Like maybe that's the point. And how would you express that? And again, we always come back to, should you be changing your position to better capture the light on your subject? So here's an example of using dappled light. And basically the effect that this is having is creating even more layers to this otherwise already kind of layered effect of the mountains. Here is an example of using soft light. So shooting on a cloudy day is a great time to be photographing waterfalls and streams, because you're not going to have sort of highlighted areas on the water that are going to blow out. So it's a great time to go out. And I'm using light in a very different way here, in that I'm positioning myself so that the bottom part of the waterfall there, using a slow shutter speed, that's basically creating a white color, which your eye is going to be drawn to, bringing you into the image. And then the yellow trees in the back are also bright, and your eye is going to basically jump there next. And so the other advantage of photographing in an overcast day is that fall colors tend to be brighter. They tend to appear brighter when it's overcast or sort of just after a rain storm. A bright sunny day tends to wash the colors out a little bit. Also, because of the light being soft, even light, flat, even light, I was able to slow the shutter speed down in order to get that blurry look of the water. And I would not have been able to do that as effectively on a brighter day. So contrast, as I mentioned, contrast, we often think of contrast as tonal contrast, which is that difference between light and dark areas of the image. So highlights and shadows, sort of the right and left part of the histogram. And midday light is very harsh light. And so when I have the time to go out during a midday photo shoot, then I'm thinking about how can I be using shadows to my advantage? And often I'm thinking about would these make good black and white images, because black and white tends to do with high contrast scenes. Excuse me. And so here, basically, the shadows become part of the subject because that vertical lines of the trees are now contrasted against the horizontal lines that are formed in the snow that wouldn't be there on a cloudy day. Tonal contrast can also, even in a more subtle way, start to add shape and depth to images. So you can use areas of highlights and shadows to create this sense of shape in sort of a 3D form. And as I mentioned, color contrast is another way that you can start to pull your subject forward from the background. So lines is probably one of the most commonly used compositional elements in landscape and nature photography. And again, as I mentioned, one of the reasons for that is because it's such an effective tool for bringing the viewer into the image, because visually we want to follow lines and paths. It's just our nature. And so in this picture, for instance, I'm using this curvature of the carved out rock as a sort of flowy, meandering exploration of this little stream. So it adds to that sort of peaceful feeling that I had when I was there. Lines can also, as they connect different parts of the scene and bring the viewer into the scene, that can make a sense of harmony and unity and flow. Leading lines are found a lot in nature. They're pretty easy to find, and they can be used as an effective way to just really say, "Here's my subject," like in this one. So I'm using the cliffs from the mountain, and their reflection are now creating these triangles pointing to the boat, so that it's very clear that, I mean, the boat would be a clear subject anyway, I think, but it's even more so with how I positioned myself relative to the lines of the mountains and the reflections. It can also create a sense of depth, by, especially if the lines are coming from one of the diagonal corners of the image. And lines can also be implied. They don't necessarily need to be real lines. And so, for instance, I don't know if you can see my mouse. Can you see my mouse
Uh,
if I wiggle it around?
yes. Yeah.
Okay. I haven't been pointing to things because I wasn't sure you could see it. So basically, there's a leading line here with how the highlighted and shadowed areas of the moss sort of create this swirly effect here. And then the trunks of the trees are effectively also creating sort of a stepping line into the back of the image. Colors are another compositional element to keep in mind, and colors have emotions associated with them. This is why we have, stop signs that are red, and, red light, green light, our yellow light. These are all the reason why these colors work, is because of how our emotions respond to them. And it's not something that we're conscious of. So this is basically just the color wheel divided in warm colors and cool colors, and the different types of emotions that can come from these colors. And so keeping this sort of in the back of your mind might help you determine, okay, well, here are the colors in my scene. This is going to really, if I have a lot of orange and reds, maybe this is going to be a more energetic looking scene versus like that stream that I just showed you, which had a lot of greens and blues in it, which are much more calm and peaceful. So there are a bunch of different types of color harmonies that are found in nature that are also very calming and pleasing to see. One of the most common ones, or easiest to understand too, is our complementary colors. So that's basically, colors that are on opposite ends of the color wheel. So, purples and um, yellows and oranges and reds and greens, for instance, are complementary colors, blues and oranges. So here's an example of having sort of that purpley blue glow in the shadow areas, complementing that warm glow of the rising sun. Here's another example of complementary colors, red and green. That's why Christmas is red and green. Again, it's a very appealing color combination to our eyes. Another type of color harmony that's often found in nature is what's called an analogous color harmony. So that's basically colors that are along the same side of the color wheel. So here, obviously, it's predominantly all different types of green, again, giving that sort of peaceful, calm feeling. So now I thought I would move into the composition case study, unless we have any questions. And I'm going to take a sip of water.
Yeah, take a sip of water. I don't see any questions, and I can tell you why. Somebody texted me and said she's so thorough. So I'm kind of thinking that applies to everybody here. So keep going.
All right, great. So this is a waterfall that I found. It's not a known waterfall or anything like that. I was just hiking in the woods. So one of the things that I love about Vermont is that you can find locations like this that feel so special because they're not anywhere in particular. They're just out in the wilderness. And so when I had heard the water, I explored my way down to see what I would find. And I found this beautiful, mossy waterfall here. And I kept trying to figure out, well, how do I want to photograph it? What is it that I want to say in this photograph? And I saw this fern and I thought, well, that could make a compelling foreground element. Let me try composing it, vertically with the fern there and see. And I just didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like, I felt like I was checking all those boxes of like, use a compelling foreground element and draw it into the background. And I felt like it did that, but it still didn't feel right to me. It didn't feel like it captured the essence of the waterfall. I felt like this was taking up too much of the frame. The tree was a little distracting. So what I did next was I climbed down and I basically stood over here on this rock because what was drawing my eye was this mossy detail on this rock up here. And so I thought, how the moss, the detail, the shadows, and there was this nice glowy light in the background. Maybe if I can set my camera up so that I'm basically peering over this rock, I'll capture just this part right here. And that's, the most interesting part. So I did that. And again, just didn't seem right. And I was still trying to figure out why. And I think it's because it feels a little unbalanced, to like, I thought this was the most interesting part, but we've got this waterfall that's just sort of a straight line right here. And it doesn't really move us through the image very well. So then I decided to just get in the water and try again. And that's where I came up with this composition, which I think works a lot better. So I went from, putting my camera here and shooting up this way to getting in the water down here. And now we've got, these rocks in the foreground basically leading us up, and we've got more of a curve to the water, which leads us to that nice light in the background. And I think that tells the story much better. It's a much more intimate look at this waterfall and captures what I was feeling when I was there, which was this special moment in the woods. And I just want to show you, this is obviously the edited image, but I want to show you the raw image just to show you how I also used post-processing to further accentuate what I was trying to express here. So here's the raw image, and you can see that there's not a whole lot of light on this rock here, which I thought was a pretty key stepping stone, as it were. There was more light on this rock, and our eyes are naturally drawn to go in this direction. And I really wanted the eye to go in this more curvy direction. So using dodging and burning in Photoshop, I brought out the highlights over here and sort of dodged things over here to get that effect. So again, this is the final result of that.
Before you move on from this image, there's a
Yeah.
couple of questions.
Oh, great.
Karen Riley wants to know, and I'll preface this with saying she's kind of brand new to photography, but she wants to know, are you using a tripod here?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yep, because I'm using a long shutter speed. So in order to get this sort of um, flowy look to the water, I don't remember my exact settings, but usually I'm shooting around for a waterfall like this. It might be around 2 seconds to capture that sort of flowy look. And so yeah, I need to be on a tripod.
Great. Another question, Jamie wants to know, could cropping out the trees on the left of the middle image focus it more? She liked that one quite a bit. So
Okay. So basically like cropping these guys out here and sort of coming down this way, maybe.
yes, that's what
Yeah,
she.
I could
Mhm.
certainly try that.
Yeah,
It would definitely change
yeah.
sort
I
of the
really like this.
balance.
Yeah, I really love this image. And then when you went to the one that you ended up with, I'm like, well, I like that one too. But this one really caught my eye. Those greens, they're just beautiful. Um,
Yeah.
Susan wants to know, what lens are you using?
For this image, I was using a 24 to 70 Tamron lens,
Okay, yeah, yeah.
which is usually my go-to lens. And I'll talk more about gear in the
Mhm.
next couple sections. But yeah, so in Vermont, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we don't have a whole lot of those big landscapes. We're not Texas. There's not a whole lot of horizon to look at because everything is a mountain or a valley, mountain or a valley. So unless you're on top of a mountain, you're just not going to get that view. And the top of the mountain needs to be clear in order to get the view. And a lot of our top mountaintops are not clear, which is very different in New Hampshire. So in New Hampshire, which is called the Granite State, the mountains there are pretty much bald. And it just has to do with the geology of how the two states were formed, or actually have very separate historical geological formations. We were not part of the same continent to begin with. Um, so it is interesting because they seem like such similar states to in a lot of ways, but they're have completely different feels. And so Vermont is much more heavily forested, and you just don't have a lot of this wide open landscape. So my point being, I rarely need to go wider than 24 millimeters for a focal length. Most of the time, that's sufficient. So 24 to 70 is usually my go-to landscape lens in Vermont.
Yeah. And I'm going to agree with Jamie's comment. She said, this one just wowed me. And
Oh.
when it popped up, I went, oh, wow. I mean, I did say
Well, thank you. That's so kind. Okay, so now I'm going to give you just some examples from my backyard, and sort of maybe a little bit about what I was thinking when I took the photo. So we have a pond, and this was in the fall, and so the pond was full of leaves. It seems like such a simple thing, but what I think this image is, basically taking advantage of patterns, and patterns are another type of compositional technique that you can use. It can be used more effectively than I did in this image if there's a way of breaking the pattern. Can draw more attention to the subject. In this image, the subject basically is this array of colors in this pattern. In this image, I called this image, I titled it Together. Um, but I think there are a couple of different things represented in this image. So there's the grouping of the three birch trees, which to me, that's where I got the togetherness. That's what it signifies to me, is being together. Um, but it's also a group that's isolated from all the other trees around it, both in being a different species and also then a different color than the surrounding trees. And so there's also this feeling of unity as a group, but also of isolation, which I think is interesting to think about. In this image, I'm taking advantage of filtered morning light. So there were other trees that were filtering the light coming through, and it gave this nice soft glow to the leaves. And so the feeling of this image would be very different in a midday harsh light situation. And so I'm taking advantage of the nature of the light here in order to express this feeling of softness and subtleness. In this image, I'm using tonal contrast to accentuate the texture of this wind-blown snow. And the contrast is created as a result of the sun setting. So it's a low angle light of the sun. So in the midday light, these lines and textures would not be nearly as apparent, or let's say on a cloudy day, they wouldn't be as apparent either. So this is an example of how you can use light to find these different compositional elements like lines and textures that could create a more sort of abstract image. And this image I'm showing because this is one of my earlier images, and I had a very entry-level DSLR, and I just had decided that I was going to take it everywhere I went. So I was out walking the dog, and the morning was a foggy morning, and the sun was coming up, and it created this really amazing glow. And I wanted to contrast it with the texture of the tree. And I admit it is not one of my favorite images by any means, but you just don't know what your images are going to end up. And so it actually ended up on the cover of Northern Woodlands magazine for their 25th anniversary edition, which just blew my mind. I did not think that this would never be, I didn't even submit it to them. They requested it. So I just wanted to show it as an example of even your own backyard can end up being an image that means a lot to somebody else. And so take your camera with you. There's a saying that the best camera is the one you have. So, you don't need fancy gear to do this kind of stuff.
It's funny, somebody popped in, I think it was Susan, that said, I like that one. So
Oh, good.
that things just speak to different, I mean, different things speak to different people. And, what sometimes when you just snap something and go, oh, I just took it. When you post it, somebody just goes on and on about it. So that's just kind of fun. So,
Yeah. Yeah. You just never know.
yeah,
So you might as well try.
yeah, exactly.
So now we'll go into the sort of the gear safety side of things. And feel free to stop me if anybody has questions about gear. Otherwise, I'll just kind of fly through it.
Okay.
So this is my basic setup. So I shoot with Nikon gear, and the only reason I do that, I have no real like preference to any manufacturer. It's just because that's what I started with. So, and it works really well. So my go-to camera bodies have historically been the D810, although I just traded it in, and the Nikon Z7. So I'm now going mirrorless, which my knees really, really appreciate because it is significantly lighter of a kit. I use a Gitzo travel tripod with a really right stuff ball head. And for most purposes, even though it's a very lightweight tripod, it works just fine for what I'm doing. I don't need anything super heavyweight. And it has a hook in case I do need to weigh it down. These are the lenses that I typically shoot with. So as I said before, my go-to lenses are the 24 to 70 focal range. And then usually if I think I'm going to do some telephoto stuff, I'll hike with the 70 to 300 because it's not nearly as a big of a beast as the 50 to 500 lens is. So I only usually bring that out if I think I might have some wildlife encounters. And then I always carry a variety of filters. And so this includes a polarizer filter, which you definitely need for water. If you were to, if you don't have any filters and you're looking to maybe get your first landscape filter, I would recommend getting a polarizer if you do any sort of water photography because it cuts down on the glare on the water. So here are the other types of filters that I tend to use. So there are neutral density filters. So these basically work like sunglasses on your camera. So they block light by certain numbers of stops. And this allows you to really slow the shutter speed down if you want to, blur the motion of water or blur the motion of the clouds or whatever. And then I also have a graduated neutral density filter, which basically goes from clear to a 3-stop neutral density. And that is helpful for when you have a high dynamic range scene and you need to sort of even out the exposure a little bit. I always carry a little multi-tool to help with, fixing my tripod or anything like that. I also carry a little bit of tape. This is just gaffer tape, which doesn't leave a residue. And I have it wrapped around an old ID card, so I don't have to carry the whole roll with me. Again, it's helpful for like, our cameras have a lot of blinking lights. And so when you're doing night photography, or even if you're maybe doing some wildlife, you want to cover up those lights. I always carry some extra batteries. I use an L bracket because it's a way to quickly switch from landscape to portrait mode without having to change the weight distribution of your tripod legs. And so it's a very convenient tool. I don't always bring this, but I like to use a shutter release cable if I can. Sometimes if I'm feeling lazy, I'll just use a timer, and that helps reduce any sort of camera shake when the shutter is released.
I noticed you have two 24 to 70s. One was a 2.8 and the other one was a 4. Is there any particular reason?
The only reason is because one's for the mirrorless camera and one's not.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I'm a big fan of Peak Design as a company. And one of the favorite things that I use of theirs is this simple, they call it the PD leash. It's just a tiny little strap. It's really, minimal. And they have these little clips. I don't know if you've seen them before, but they're just quick release clips. So you can quickly take the strap on and off, which I find to be super helpful, especially in windy conditions. And then I have ways of protecting my camera. So this is just basically a plastic bag. It's a rain cover for cameras. It can go over my camera and tripod, and some cloths and other cleaning tools. And the rain jacket is also helpful for night photography. I don't know how humid it gets down where you guys are, but in the summertime up here, it can get quite humid. And so if you're doing night sky photography, you do need to cover up your camera, or you'll get covered in dew. These are the two packs that I typically hike with. The Atlas pack I find to be very comfortable. I'm, a petite woman, so most camera packs don't fit me very well, and I find them to be pretty uncomfortable for hiking. But I have found that the Athlete works really well for the mirrorless system. It will not work for the DSLR. It's too small on the inside, whereas the f-stop bag will work really well, and I can fit a lot more camera gear in the f-stop bag, but I can fit a lot more hiking gear in the Atlas pack. So speaking of hiking, I'll just go over some outdoor clothing that I typically wear, even in the summertime. I pack this stuff in Vermont. One reason is because not that it gets so cold here in the summertime, but how rapidly the weather changes, especially on mountaintops. So it could be 80 degrees and sunny at the base of a mountain, and you get up to the top, and you could have a severe thunderstorm with hail. And it doesn't really snow in the summertime, but it has snowed in the beginning of June before, and it's just, you got to be prepared. And you don't want to, if you end up injured, that's always my fear is like, what if I hurt myself and I have to spend the night out here? So I always pack like this lightweight puffy jacket. It weighs next to nothing, and it can compress down, being that it's made out of down. So it can, be just this tiny little thing in my pack, and it can give a lot of safety. Winter is a different story. So winter does get quite cold. So I do end up wearing a lot of different layers. That's the key is layers. So when you're doing a lot of hiking like I'm doing, you're going to end up sweating a lot, but you don't want to be wet and then stop and photograph, because you'll get freezing cold really fast. So the trick is to just keep all these layers and strip them off, put them on, strip them off, put them on, and try to not actually like break a sweat. And so these are all the different layers that I'll typically wear when I'm photographing out in the winter. And then this is how I get around. So I'll almost always hike with my snow boots. They're hiking snow boots with these things called micro spikes, which are basically like a light version of crampons. I like to hike in them even in just snowy conditions, unless I'm breaking trail, meaning that, there might be 2 feet of snow on the ground and I'm falling through the snow, in which case I would need the snowshoes. But for the most part, the micro spikes are great for traction, and they're great in most slippery conditions. I learned the hard way that crampons are actually a good option to have. Being that, Linda talked about me falling into the stream. Yes, that I broke through ice and I fell into a stream, and that was unfortunate. But then worse than that was I was on this hike that was basically across from a waterfall, and I was wearing rain pants, so like Gore-Tex pants, and it was winter, and there was a tree that had fallen and sort of braced itself on the edge of this cliff. And I had been there before, and I knew that the tree was stable. And I don't recommend, I don't think I made very wise decisions here, but I decided that, ooh, if I could get down to the tree, I'll be, around this branch and I'll get a better view of this waterfall. And I had my micro spikes on, and I thought all was good, except that it was sheer ice. And as soon as I sat down on the ice with my slippery rain pants on, I slipped under the log and almost off the cliff, like to my death. And the only thing that saved me was my camera on the tripod, because I hooked it onto the log and was able to like suspend myself there for a moment while I tried to figure out how to get back up again. So I learned a lot of things in that experience. 1, crampons. 2, don't do stupid things like that. 3, don't wear rain pants when it's icy. Water and on top of ice is very slippery. So anyway.
And you do a lot of this stuff by yourself. That's
I
what's
do. Yeah. Yeah, I prefer to do it by myself, but I do understand the dangers in that. Snowshoes, as I mentioned, very key for breaking trail if you're in a lot of deep, fluffy snow. Hiking poles are always helpful to have, not just for stability, but they can also help you sort of test the snow and surfaces, which I should have had in that video where I fell through the ice. Waders are great for getting into water, especially if it's like in the spring or the fall when the water is getting cold. I always pack a headlamp, regardless of time of day or wherever I'm going, just in case I get delayed somehow and I end up out after dark. Hand warmers are also a really good thing to pack because they're lightweight, and my hands and feet get freezing cold all the time. So I always have these with me. A compass, because if you get lost, it can help. And at least around here, unless you're in town, you pretty much don't have cell service. So, your phone may die if it's searching for, so it's not, you can't just rely on your phone and for that. So it's good to have a compass. I always also pack a first aid kit for, minor cuts and things like that. Water, and I'll give a little tip on water. So if you're hiking in the cold, since we're talking about winter here, one tip is to pack with your water bottle upside down, because the water will freeze to the top first. And the ice will be at the top, and it won't freeze the cap, and you'll still be able to access the water. And if you're hiking with a like a hydration bladder, then what you should do is blow air into it after you've had some water, so that the whole pipe tubing doesn't freeze. That's happened to me a number of times. I also always bring some sort of calorie dense snacks, extra socks, and I think that's it. Oh, wool gloves or insulated gloves, because my hands do get super cold. So a couple of just basic safety tips. It's always good to know before you head out on trail. So make sure you understand the trail description, the map, have a copy of the map on you somehow. You might want to look ahead and see what the trail conditions are and the forecast, and whether there are any changes in wildlife behavior for that time of year. So is it mating season? Is it, calving season or something like that? So that if you were to encounter wildlife on your hike, you would know hopefully how to respond appropriately. This is especially for the Northeast, and I imagine the Northwest as well. Is always a good idea to bring an additional insulation layer and outer layer for protection. Always tell somebody your hiking plan. And if you don't have somebody to tell, leave the hiking plan, on your counter before you leave. So in case you do get hurt and someone needs to go find you, they know where to start looking. We already talked about the first aid kit and water. Around here, it's really important in the summertime to have bug and tick repellent. Really, I don't know how are ticks down in Texas? Do you guys have them?
I think we do have them. That's not something I run across. We have more mosquito issues than I do,
Yeah.
but I'm sure they're somewhere. They're just not where I am. I don't venture into those places.
Erin's saying yes.
We can have
Yeah.
lessons later on tick removal, Linda.
Yeah. They are so nasty. And And they're really getting worse. Every year it's so much worse. And so when you're, on your belly trying to photograph, you're going to come home with some ticks. So having repellent or searching yourself, every time you come home, it's a good idea to do that. And in certain times of year up here, also having a bear bell, especially if you're hiking alone, which is just basically like a jingle bell that you can attach to your backpack or your hiking pole, and just making some noise. You can also sing or whistle, and just let the bears know that you're there. They don't want to see you, so long, and but they really don't want to be surprised by you. So that's the idea.
So Brenda, the reason we're laughing is because last year I was up in Montana and everybody had a really good time one Wednesday night because I'd run into the bears, the grizzlies.
Oh, no.
And I'm like, I was hauling ass out of there. Like people are like, did you get a picture? I'm like, no, I got out of there. And they're like, chicken. That's John. John was that one.
Yeah, I can understand. And a safety whistle is also a good thing to have. Sometimes you can get them that they just clip onto your pack here. So say you do fall and you need help, you can just easily blow for help and people will more likely hear you. And then of course there's protecting you, but there's also protecting your gear. So I find that, I do a lot of photography in snow. These little microfiber cloths are great for just lying over top of your camera like that and keeping the snow off. Even on a non-sunny day, your lens hood will provide a level of protection so that your lens glass here doesn't get too wet, but it's also good to have lens cloths that you can clean that won't scratch the glass. Another tip is that if you are photographing in snow and in water, and say you're not doing a lot of hiking, you're going right back to your car, keep your tripod legs extended if you can, and wipe them down, let them dry out. When you get home, extend them, let them dry out overnight, and that will, keep them durable over the long run. And always, inspect and clean your gear when you get home. So this brings me to my next point, is that when you start to prepare for an outing like this, it starts when you get home. So clean all of your equipment. This is my process anyway. Clean all the equipment, recharge the batteries. So I have this little bookshelf in my office with how I've got my gear all organized. I've got my little chargers up here, so I can just plop the batteries in there. As soon as they're charged, I can get them back in my bag. Transfer images off the memory cards and back them up. Clear the memory cards, and then I repack my gear to get it ready. Because there's sometimes when the weather is doing the right thing and, I just want to be able to grab and go and not be like, where are my batteries? Where are my memory cards? And my lens is dirty. And I've had that sting before and miss opportunities. So other ways to prepare for your outing is to research locations. And so one way that I like to do this around here is to use DeLorme Atlas and Gazetteer. They have them for every state in the US, and it can give you lots of really detailed information about even, back roads and natural areas and places of interest that you're not going to really get from, say, tourist websites and that sort of thing. Google Earth is another great tool for, especially if it's a location you've never been to before and you're wondering, well, is the mountaintop clear there? I don't know, so you can go into Google Earth and figure that out. As we already talked about, Photopills is another great photo planning app. And here's my pitch for my Photopills Friday. So I have two seasons. Yeah, two seasons of Photopills Friday. So I tried to keep the videos relatively short so that they were easy to digest. And it's not like I'm a diehard Photopills user, but it is nice to have that tool when you need it. And then, of course, researching different trail websites if you're looking for different places to explore. And one that I go to often is called All Trails. So you could check that out for trails in your location. And then it's always a good idea to research if you need any sort of permits to get into, even if it's a state park, often there are types of permits that you need.
Before you go too far, there's a question from Susan. And so she does want to know, what is Photopills?
Okay, so Photopills is a photography planning app. It basically incorporates like global GPS data on a map, and you can say, use it with Google Earth to start to figure out a location. But what it also incorporates is, sun, moon, Milky Way, and all of these different sort of, lighting and night sky situations. So you can say, hone in on the map, drop a pin on the map and be like, okay, I want to photograph on the top of this mountain on this day, and I'm going to look west. Will I see a full moon in my composition? And that it can help you dial in sort of the day, the time, where you should be in order to get the composition that you want when you're including things like sunrise, sunset, moon, Milky Way, meteors. Outside of that, I don't really use it at all. One of the features that's really cool with Photopills, besides all of that, is it has an augmented reality feature. And so say you are on location or you're scouting a location and you're thinking, well, this location has a southwesterly view. I think I could get the Milky Way. Let me see. If I come in August, will I get the Milky Way? And you can hold your phone up and use the augmented reality to see, will the Milky Way be there? And will it be horizontal in the sky or vertical in the sky and stuff like that? So it really helps with those types of things. The downside of Photopills is that it is super complicated. It's really hard to learn it. It took me, I think I had it on my phone for like 2 years before I finally buckled down and was like, okay, I need to learn how to use this. and I just thought other people must have trouble learning this too. And so once I started to understand it, that's why I decided to do that series. All right. So before we end, I'll give you some exercises to try in your own backyard. So one of my favorite things to do is to use restrictions to spark creativity. And this can be in many different forms. So one could be, pick one of the 4 compositional elements that we talked about. So that's light, color, lines, and contrast. Pick one of those and focus on that for just 1 month. Don't worry about anything else. Just focus on, how am I seeing light, or can I start seeing contrast, and how am I going to express that in the image? And that will sort of flex that muscle and you'll start to get used to seeing that. Another option would be to use, say you have a lens that you never use or a focal length that's just not comfortable for using, and you just not, it's not your go-to thing. Try that and challenge yourself to use it and find compositions at that focal length. You can do the same thing with depth of field. If you're someone who like in landscape photography, you're often using a deep depth of field, spend a couple of weeks or a month doing only images in a shallow depth of field and see how that changes how you start to see things. Another thing would be to go to a favorite location, but don't shoot your favorite subject. Try to find 10 unique compositions before you leave. Another thing that we kind of touched upon with the case study that we did with cropping out those trees, another thing that I like to do sometimes, and it's a good thing to do during a pandemic when we can't go anywhere, is to go through your portfolio and just start cropping the heck out of your images to see if you can find a composition within the composition. And it's not that will become a final image necessarily, but it will help you start to see things differently. And then if you can go back to those locations and figure out, okay, how can I now compose this image so that I would get that cropped result? Another thing that can be helpful is to pick your favorite photographer whose work you really admire and go through their portfolio and start asking yourself, okay, well, what is the subject and what is the image about? Sort of like we did in those earlier exercises. And then, try to assess the nature of the light. Where is the light coming from? What's the quality of the light and how is that contributing to the feeling of the image? And are there any other compositional elements that they're using that support the subject? Do you see lines? Do you see contrast? And you can even take it another step and try to imagine if those things weren't there, would the image change somehow? Another thing that's fun to do is just to take your camera on any walk you go on or walk around your yard and, tell yourself you're not allowed to come inside until you've taken 10 or 20 compositions. And think about things like, okay, well, why am I compelled to create this? What drew my eye? What is it about? And what am I trying to express in the image? So these are just some fun exercises to try. So here is how you can get in touch if you'd want. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm teaching a composition course. Well, it's basically just it's a virtual workshop that I'm doing live called Compose with Clarity. So if you want to find out more about that, there's the website. We already talked about Outdoor Photography School, the website, and the YouTube channel. My outdoor photography podcast is on Apple, iTunes, and Spotify and all those places, but it's only a trailer episode so far. But the first real episode is coming out on April 6th. And it's basically going to be a mixed style podcast where I have interviews every other week and then a solo episode every other week where I give like a tidbit about photography. And the people who I'm interviewing include both photographers, landscape and nature photographers, but also outdoor folks who can teach about some of these different skills of being in the outdoors. And then that's my Instagram if you want to say hi over there. And then if you want to check out any of my images, that's my portfolio website. And that's it. So, and I'd love to take any more questions.
To be honest, Brenda, there weren't a lot of questions and I was kind of surprised. And then somebody texted me and said, she is so thorough. And I'm thinking that's why there aren't any questions in here. There was one or two in there and you answered them as you were going through. So I didn't see anything in there, which is wonderful. But I do want to read just one or two little comments that were made. Mika said, beautiful, so many wonderful photos and observations. Someone else said, great advice about lighting. And that is very, very true. I was sitting there thinking, gosh, she's really got the lighting down. And I believe it was Jamie that said road trip. And there's a whole handful of people that agreed with her. And if you haven't been to Vermont, please go.
Yes.
I've been once and I went in I told you, in peak season, and coming from South Texas, I had never seen anything like it. And I took hundreds of photos of red leaves. And then, as we're racing to the airport, I'm like gathering leaves. And my friend's like, how many of those do you really need? Like, just leave me alone. But they were so beautiful. Let's see here. Somebody is saying, let's do photo walks here. So I think you might have boosted the Vermont tourism.
All right.
all alone. So this excellent presentation, so much information. This is from Susan that says, I like your motto that there is no bad light. And,
good.
And thank you from her. For me, one of the things that you said, it just went, the light went off, and it's, what is the scene about rather than what is it of? And I just thought, gosh, I mean, I know it's so fundamental, but I'd never really thought of it that way. So gosh, with a deep heartfelt thank you for coming on and doing this for this group. So appreciated. And not everybody's from Texas, but if you do make it down here, you're probably going to have a few friends that'll go, we'll meet you for Mexican food.
Oh, that would be great. I would love that.
Yeah. So, okay.
And definitely reach out if any of you end up coming up to Vermont, I'd love to connect. So yeah.
Are you doing, I know you do online workshops. Are you doing in-person workshops?
I've never done an in-person workshop. And I thought about, before the pandemic, I had considered whether to start doing that this past year. And then the pandemic hit and I thought, okay, forget it. I'm not going to do that then. So it's still up in the air. Partly because my schedule is kind of difficult right now. So it's hard for me to take, a week off to help people. I would love to do that. I would love to have that in-person connection. It's just not that feasible at the moment, but someday.
All right. Was there anything, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Was there anything else you wanted to say?
No, only thank you so much for this opportunity. This was a lot of fun. And I really appreciate everybody coming in, and all your kind comments are really nice. So thank you.
And I'll make sure you get a copy of that so you can see what they said. Guys, you can connect with Brenda through her website at outdoorphotographyschool.com. And if you're on Instagram, be sure to look for her at Brenda Petrella. I wanted you to check out the Happiness Hour blog, community blog. So earlier today, a new article by Gail Feddick was posted, which is called Wildflowers, Beauty and Bloom, which is perfect timing since wildfire season is literally starting right now here in Texas. And I wanted to thank Elaine Pruden for helping me manage the community blog. Elaine is losing a lot of sleep in between our texts and late night calls, so I could not do this without her patience. Let me emphasize patience and her supports. So if you'd like to contribute an article, just take a look at the invitation on my website, lindanickell.com, for details. Next week, we've got 2 Happiness Hour sessions on the schedule. On Wednesday, Michael Rung returns to present Setting Goals to Make Good Pictures. And on Thursday, Mika Geiger and special guest Master Gardener Barbara Vance will present a bonus session called Photographing Our Hidden World. So until next time, go out and create something beautiful. And I hope that we will see you again soon.